Welcome to the Planbpreneur podcast. This podcast is for professionals, entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, and leaders who want to create greater income and impact. On the podcast, we explore strategies, tools, and techniques for creating multiple streams of income, launching your entrepreneurial dreams, and living a life of impact. We bring to you amazing guests and experts, as well as practical opportunities to help you achieve your entrepreneurial goals. This is the Planbpreneur podcast, and I am your host, Demi. Hey, Vumi, thanks again for this conversation. Thanks for joining me. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. You're one of those people, when I just see stuff that you're doing and stuff that you're putting out, puts a smile on my face. And I'm super grateful to be connected to you and see all the work that you're doing. That is inspiring. So you taking the time out to come to this conversation and share your insights, I'm super, super grateful, and I'm looking forward to it. So thank you again for joining me, Vumi.
Thanks for having me, Demi. I'm quite excited for our conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Glad to hear that. And just as we go into it, I know that there's a few things I know about you, about your work, being a leader in this career space, but you've done a ton of stuff before that. You do consulting still, and you have your hands in many pots, like in many places. Those are good stuff that I can't wait to hear about in this conversation. But I want to really start out with hearing about how you describe yourself. How do you describe all the things that you do and who you are? Yeah.
So I find my work quite simplistic in that what I, in essence, do is I connect people from where they are to where it is that they're wanting to be in their careers. And my job, in essence, is to help organizations do the same thing. So I do it through coaching, I do it through consulting, I do it through my radio show, my TV show, my columns in various publications across the continent. That's what I do. Where are you wanting to be in your career? Where are you?
Mm.
That differential. How can we close that gap as quickly as possible? And for me, it's always quite interesting because people will say, "Oh, for me, I'm an entrepreneur, so I don't have a career." And I define career a little bit
Mm.
differently. I define career as your life's work. So, what do you do for a living? And for some of us, we get paid for that living. For some of us, may be very fortunate, married very well, and you don't have to actually get paid. But whatever is your life's work is what I'm interested in. What do you want to spend your days doing, and how can we get you doing that in the quickest, most efficient time possible?
And yeah, that's good. I like that and I haven't heard, people, there's different definitions of career out there, and this is an interesting perspective that I'll be curious to hear about. But first, I like the way you simplified everything that you do in like one or two sentences, and I'm curious to know, how did you boil it down to that? How did you get to the point where you were able to say, okay, this is what I do, but then it manifests across these different platforms? What was this journey doing that like?
I spend a lot of time in corporate and a lot of time doing a number of different things. And when I turned 30, and I took the time out to really be able to understand what my business was going to focus on, I needed to be able to distill it. And I'm a big believer in that we all have a creativity inside of us that wants to be expressed. One of my favorite quotes is God is an artist. You look at a sunset and you know that,
Mm.
right? You know that the
Yeah.
intelligence from which we come from expresses itself in different things, from the nucleus through to, the evolved human being. The same thing is happening just in different levels. So I needed to be able to articulate to myself, what do I do? And I used to be like, oh, I'm a teacher. I'm like, that sounds great, but what am I teaching? And I realized I'm not so much a teacher purely as I am a connector. And what am I connecting? And it's really connecting the version of ourselves at our best in this particular arena to where we are now. And the moment that clicked for me, I was like, oh, that's exactly what I do, because it's the same thread being woven across the various platforms. And I think when I was able to articulate for myself, because I recall explaining to my mom and dad that, oh, okay, I'm leaving my executive role and it's in a multinational telecommunications company. Yes, I've lived in Germany and Singapore, and I look after Nigeria and Congo and Mozambique, and I'm going to be a coach. They were like, a what? And, the Zulu word for coach is
Yeah.
Mqeqeshi. And my father was like, you don't even play soccer. Who are you coaching? And I was like, no, not like that. And I had to be able to articulate in quite simplistic terms to my mom and dad what it was that I was doing. Not in the lingo of a big city, but of a small town. And the moment I
That's
could do
good.
that for them and myself, it made what I do a lot easier to articulate.
Yeah, that's good. That's such a good. That's a good insight. I know people who say, tell me what you do in the language that a 5 year old would understand, and that's such a powerful lesson to say. Simplify um, what you're talking about in a way that anybody, for that matter, can understand and will not misunderstand you, so to speak. And I'm curious, like you were saying now, you had this journey where you're an executive in a multinational and you decided to go do coaching, you transition to business, right? I'm curious to hear, number one, what was that journey like, right? Like, what were you doing in those earlier years? But how did you get to the point as well where you decided and you made that decision? And perhaps what were some of the things that triggered or informed that for you?
So I come from quite an entrepreneurial family. So I've grown up with my grandfather was literally owning businesses, butcheries, properties, which is quite unheard of because I grew up in apartheid South Africa. So a black man
Mm,
owning that already was quite disruptive. And as I was doing my education, I was fortunate enough to be able to go to, high school and university when South Africa was liberated from its colonial masters. And in that opportunity came a number of vacancies for black people. One of those was accounting. So of course they were like, you study, you become a chartered accountant. And I was like, no, I want to be an actress. My mother's like, what?
mm.
And if you're born in Africa, you know what that means. You want to do what?
Yeah.
Any? What is that? And I was like, no, like on TV. My mother's like, yeah, 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 yeah. I've never seen. There was a massive soap in South Africa called Generations, and one of the actresses was Sophie. My mom was like, did Sophie go to school to study this? And I was like, no, but then maybe I'll be a lawyer. My mother's like, I'm not convinced. Because remember, a lot of the guys who were anti regime, like the Nelson Mandelas, the Oliver Tambos, were attorneys
Yeah.
and they were paupers. My mother was like, yeah, I think this accounting thing where you count people's money, you also get some money. And you've got a scholarship, so you go and study that. So that's where I started. So I started studying
Interesting.
accounting, and I was it was not my best subject. Not by I had several A's in matric, and one of them was not accounting. That was one of the subjects I did
Um,
not get a distinction for, but it's what I got a scholarship for. So I studied that, and I quickly realized that it was not my passion, but I had to make it make sense. So I changed from accounting to finance, and I started out at the bank, literally at the call center, and I sort of worked my way up. Giving insights to the CEO that were unwarranted. The beauty of being young, talented, and African, right? And unafraid. And I think I was very
mm,
fortunate in growing up in a home where
that's good.
my grandparents would bring me in when we were meeting with our attorneys, who at times were Caucasian. So I was unafraid. I would just speak my mind. And I think it also was instilled even in my high school days where I was the only black girl in my grade and I was encouraged to speak my mind. So I saw the CEO and I spoke my mind. And it's a good thing I did because I opened my mouth wide enough to put myself in a fix where eventually he was like, you've got a lot to say about this. You fix it. And I was like, no, that's not what I
Mm,
meant. And it created an opportunity
too
for
late.
me that saw me speaking to some of our senior clients that created opportunities for me to get headhunted and move to the United Kingdom and live and work there and do my MBA there and work a little bit in London. Came back home, um, worked a bit, and then started working for another British company where I was looking after Africa, looking after service strategy and operations. But because of my childhood, where there was always that inherent, you don't work for another person. There was that inherent, you pay rent. What is rent? They pay rent to you, not
Mm,
the other way around, which found me at 22 buying my
interesting.
first property. So there was always
Mm,
that finite space when it came to working for somebody else. And my grandfather, I think, instilled a lot of that in me mentally, of you will be your own boss. You people pay you, and people pay you for services, and you pay people salaries. That's what gets done. So I think I underestimated being involved in the family business at such a young age that it would, in essence, find me transitioning naturally from an executive into an entrepreneur.
oh, wow, that's is so good. One of the reasons I say that is because, just reflecting on how some of these values, like you're talking about, and this um, work ethic and everything, and just the thinking and the mindset was transferred. That is such, like you said, it's something that you were quite fortunate to have that kind of family and that system, and I think it highlights the gap and the opportunities that families can actually have in certain people or in certain also for success, right, in the stuff that we do on the continent. So now it makes sense, right? Because you were always going to go this way. Uh, so so it speaks because that's what was modeled, right, and that's what you saw was the right way to be. And I'm curious to see as you went through this transition, was it a calculated transition? Just curious, and how did you navigate getting to the point where you got your feet on the ground stable, because you're an executive in a big company that it's different from being an entrepreneur, because that's a whole different game. So how did you navigate that?
Well, the first reality check is that when I say, hi, I'm Vumi Msweli, I'm the client services partner for Africa at Vodafone, you automatically, I'm saying I need a meeting, you accept. When I say, hi, I'm Vumi Msweli, I'm the CEO of Chesed Consulting, you're like, sorry, what? Hey, what? How do you pronounce that? What's your name?
Yeah,
That's the first big reality check.
that
And
real.
I think even though there was fear there, I knew eventually that I would run my own shop. And for me, that came from what I wanted to build. And I grew up in a family where legacy business was big. So I knew I wanted legacy business. And,
Mm,
sometimes I tussle with this, but I'm an African woman. So my ability to have freedom of time to raise children and be a mother and be a partner was also very important to me. And I was fortunate enough, I've studied in New York, I've studied and lived in London. I knew the limitations that corporate would put on. I knew what it was like to work till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning because that's a deal we're working on. And I can't say, oh, sorry, I've got to go home and be a mum now. That was just not how the exposure I had to business, even when I was in Germany or Singapore, it was the same thing. So I knew to have that kind
yeah,
of freedom, I would need to be my own boss. Not saying that I work less, I probably work more, but the flexibility afforded me because I signed my own check is fundamentally different. So I knew that
yeah.
that's what I need. Even now, I'm busy studying and I'm doing my doctorate. I can say to my team, I don't take meetings on Fridays and not take them
Okay.
because it's a research day. I can say to my
Yeah.
team, Wednesday afternoon, I'm not going to be here. I'm flying home. I miss my mom. I can say to my team, guys, cancel Monday. I'm going to Tanzania and lie on the beach in Dar es Salaam or Zanzibar because that's what my soul needs. Um, so
Mm,
I knew that that would be one of the reasons. And we go into entrepreneurship for different reasons. For me, it was to fulfill my life's call, and that call on different levels. As an individual,
that's good.
as a family member, as a business person. And it had to be fulfilling it on my terms. And that's why I chose entrepreneurship.
That's good. That's good. And just like you were saying, and that is totally respected, because I think the point here is also level of self awareness. I think there's tons. I don't know the I don't have a data to this, but I guess that there's tons of people that are not asking themselves the right questions about what they really want and what fulfills them, and are rather going along this prescribed approaches. And what I'm hearing from you is saying, you know what, regardless of what is happening out there, how big the other job might be, what you really want is these are the priorities for you, and that's what is going to guide. And that's the reason you're going to entrepreneurship, which I think is powerful as a lesson. You said something about transitioning, and you could use Vodafone, and people open doors for you, and people you said, and people are. If I hope I pronounce that correctly. People are like, what's all that? What's that about? How did you, how did you navigate around that over time? Right. I just want to know how you dealt with these challenges, uh, and how have you continued to evolve that over time?
So the first was letting go of my company name. It's something that was very important to me, but people didn't do business with Hesed. People did business with Vumi Msweli. So getting comfortable bringing myself to the business. Where initially when you start a business, you open up the pages and you are posting your business pages, and then you quickly realize they actually aren't interested. People are interested in Vumi, but Hesed invoices. And once they buy into Vumi and my philosophy, then they remember the business name, then I can pass them on to one of our partners. So that for me was a very big lesson to learn, was to let go of the business as I had thought about it in my mind. The second part for me was getting comfortable in knowing that I wasn't an entrepreneur. For a while, I had to be self employed. And there's a difference. Self employed is if you're not there, the business falls apart. And to build a business, sometimes you've got to be self employed, meaning you've got to put in the hours. It's got to be around you before you can scale to a point where you are now an entrepreneur and you've built a business. And I was so focused on building the business that I almost didn't want to bring that element of me. The moment I brought myself in, it enriched the business. So that was a massive lesson for me to learn. And obviously, remember, I come from an accounting background, so I'm
That's
like,
good.
business accounts must be separate. Blah, blah, blah. I need to, and
Yeah.
there's a lot, and people don't tell you this, but there's a lot of unlearning when you come from corporate into entrepreneurship. Certain things just don't work.
Interesting.
The structures that
Yeah.
exist in corporate serve a big animal like corporate well. They don't serve the agility needed for a startup. I needed to get comfortable
That's good.
real quick in doing and wearing many hats. Where I've got to read the contracts, I've got to run around and do business development, I've got to do this, putting my personal assistants through training for sales. Because I'm like, no, guys, you don't say I'm not available. Is it a business deal? I'm always available. Which in corporate, it's like, no, 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 sorry, you can book in 2 weeks. I'm like, it's a hot lead. I'm available now. So it's a
Yeah.
different philosophy and way of approaching things. And you need to throw away the executive hat when you're building a business and get real comfortable, putting your getting your hands dirty. And then also the biggest thing for me, and this is a lesson I'm still learning, getting comfortable with rejection.
Mm,
Knowing that clients are going to just be like, no, for no reason at all. Where if you're in a
yeah.
corporate, they're the ones begging for your time.
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the
Yeah.
differences I've experienced.
That is so good. That is so good. Such insightful stuff. And that last point you mentioned about, like, you're out there now, you're vulnerable, you are not wearing the armor of the corporate that protects you. And that can be really challenging and demoralizing for people as well if you don't know that before time. And maybe you probably just run back to where you're coming from with your tail between your legs and all that. And you mentioned something powerful about the fact that people it starts with Vumi and people see Vumi and then they go back and see the business. So it was really being able to put that front and center. Do you think? And I've heard people say this to say that we're in the age of the personal brand, where and it's more profitable perhaps to build a personal brand because then you can have a number of things attached to that. Is that something that you're trying to do as well? And what are your thoughts on that? And how are you doing that?
So I've had to. So I am a big believer, as one of my mentors, John Nathan Jones, always says, get a subject matter expert. So I literally, as
Mm,
part of my team, have gotten, monetization coaches, sales coaches who come in and support us. And it was a massive transition for us for it to be around what is Vumi doing on my personal pages to transfer that business to my business pages. So I do everything from hosting webinars, hosting challenges, speaking in public, um, really redefining what employee wellness is from a corporate perspective. I'm on radio in Botswana, Nigeria, South Africa, Zambia. I write articles. I've recently gotten my own column. I've had my own column, in articles I've written for Better Niger, The Guardian in Nigeria, Business Day in Nigeria, South Africa, True Love, Destiny, to get
yeah.
the concept of what career coaching is. And that's also another challenge I've got in my particular industry is I am bringing to the fore a concept that specifically in SADC is quite rare. So that's also another challenge. A lot of us are building businesses where we've got to educate our customer before selling.
Mm,
And a
yeah.
company doesn't educate, an individual does. So repositioning what it is that we do from that perspective for me has been important. And having conversations. I was like, my mom was laughing. She's like, are you on TV again? Because everyone's phoning me. And I'm like, I don't even own a TV. So I always know I'm on TV because when I go to the supermarket, then everyone's like, Vumi, 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 and they want autographs. I'm like, okay, I must have been on TV recently, and I don't even know because I don't own one.
Interesting.
But that's where my market is. So I've got to go to
Mm,
where they are. Same thing in Nigeria. I'll have
that's
my
good.
friends saying, "Oh, we just saw you on Arise News." Oh, okay. Oh, and I wouldn't have even realized. But that's where my market is. I must go to my market. My market, this is Africa, is never going to come to me. So it's important for you
Mm,
to understand that. And the same is true for even big corporates. The difference with big corporates is that they've created enough of a market for themselves that the market knows where they are. No one knows you. So you've got to go to them.
mm, interesting. Super, super insightful. Vumi, how did you get all the, just talking about building a brand and going to where your market is, practically speaking, like how did you get all this writing and TV and all that? Like you talked about the TV stations across this multiple countries, there's columns across, there's big newspapers, major blogs. How did you get into all that? And how did you do that?
So I'll tell you the story of me getting into the Guardian Nigeria. So the Iburu family owns, um, the Guardian in Nigeria. I literally was living in
Mm,
Lagos. I inboxed him every second day. Every second day, I would send a message. Every time I saw someone who was friends with him, I'd be like, listen, you need to tell him that I need to have my own column. And he
mm,
literally, I think I just wore him down. He was like, okay, fine, right. And that's how that happened. With Better Niger,
mm,
I was in Durban, my hometown, and a Forbes woman was having their annual conference there, and Uche Pedro was there. So we were sitting at the same table. I chatted to her. I was like, I'd like to write for your publication. That's how that happened.
oh, wow.
Destiny was interesting. Destiny magazine at the time was probably one of the biggest publications in the country. Um, and I had them on my vision board, and it was the funniest thing because they came to shoot me in my house, and I took out my vision board. I'm like, "See, guys, you've been on my vision board," and they were writing an article about me, and I was like, "Can I write an
Yeah.
article?" And that's how that happened. With True Love,
Wow.
getting my column, I won. I won one the Reader's Choice for Woman of the Future, which is It's a huge award here in South Africa. And I was sitting across the table from one of the editors, and I was like, I've been reading your magazine since I was 9 years old. You should give me my own column. They're like, should we? Let's see what you've done. And I sent through some of my thoughts, and that's how I got it. So it was literally taking advantage of every single opportunity, every space I found myself. And for me, it was always a clear vision. It was, how do I become a thought leader in the space? People call me now, Africa's leading career coach, and that was very intentional. Even the organizations I chose were Pan African because I always knew I wanted to be the best that I could be from a Pan African level. And it was intentional. It was intentional to go to Nigeria because I'd lived and studied in Ghana, and my friends were like, "Don't go to Lagos, eh? You will never survive. It's the hardest place." And I was like,
Mm.
"Do you know me? I'm Zulu, and we've got this saying in Zulu, "Uyabasaba na hai, asibasabi siyabafuna." Are you afraid of them? No, we're not afraid of them. We want them. It's almost like, let's have them for lunch. That
Mm.
what we fear, we
That's good.
consume.
Oh
And
wow,
that was always my mentality, right? So you can take the girl out of Zululand, but
love
you
it.
can't take the mentality of Zululand out of the girl. And that's why I packed my
Yeah.
bags and moved to Lagos, because they said it would be hard and I wouldn't make it. So of course I had to make it there.
Oh wow. Well, now, Vumi, thanks for sharing this. This is so powerful. I two things I want to go back to is one, you when you share this way, and I appreciate your honesty. You make it accessible. You make it possible that people can do it because I've seen conversations where people put themselves in media and then they say, hey, you know what, the media approached me. You see what I mean? Like to brag about. So those case in point is especially, there's this papers, this eating channels in the US and all that, where you can pay maybe like $200 or $100 or something, and you get published in papers. And then I see a number of coaches putting that stuff out, and they're like, "Hey, we've been published in this papers.
I
Have you gotten
I
on this
personally
papers?"
never paid for media. Demi, I don't
That's
believe in
good.
it. I
That's
don't believe
that's
in it. I'm not saying I will
yeah,
not in future, but thus far
yeah.
I have never paid for media. Thus far.
That's good.
But the
That's
market
good. I
changes.
think,
Next
and
week
it's
I might
because
pay. You never know.
yeah, exactly. No, I think it's strategy, right? I think it
Mm.
depends. Like you're saying, you go to where your market is. So if you, like you're saying, next week, if you need to pay to get to where your market is, it makes sense.
Well,
But I think what I was getting to is even like is a point where people pay for media and make it feel like, okay, you know what, I was approached or featured, which is also sort of like um I don't know, cluttering the space where coaching and consulting, where you can differentiate between who has value and all that. Of course, people who have value would always rise to the top, like you're saying. But I think one thing, like a number of things, like you said, was you made the ask. You said it twice today. You mentioned the fact that you would speak your mind, but then also for all these things, you I think, like you said, when they saw your work, they took on immediately, but you had to ask for it. They took it on when, but you had to ask for it. You had to say, you know what, you guys ought to give me this, and you were super, super intentional about it with a vision board, but also just thinking about how you wanted to position yourself. And I think that's powerful. And I'm curious. I don't know if it's again to that upbringing, because it's something I want to understand about your mentality, right? Your mindset. Like how do you think about the world? How do you think about the opportunities? What drives you to God and actually say, you know what, I should be in that space, or I want to take on this, or you speaking to like a gatekeeper and say, you know what, I need to be inside of that space, or I need. What's that in your mind, and where's that coming from?
I will be honest. I think my grandfather has a great deal to do with that. Um,
Mm,
so my grandfather growing up, I recall we would drive all over our city. And my grandfather made me believe I'd left the country long before, where at some point, as a black South African, the chance of you having a passport, 0 to 9. And my
mm,
grandfather would do something as simple as there was a big hole close to when we drive to the northern part of KZN into our village. There was a big hole with lots of water. My grandfather would be like, "Now that's the big hole. In that big hole, Queen Elizabeth got her jewels. We are in Kimberley, South Africa. Carry on driving. Place called Jamaica, where we because lots of Rastafarians. you fell asleep. See, now you just missed Bob Marley. That's Kingston, Jamaica. And my
Oh
grandfather
wow,
in our city would make me feel like I traveled the world because he read a lot. He had a fourth grade
that's cool.
education, but he read and consumed a lot because at that time when he was growing up, he couldn't have access to education. They couldn't
Mhm.
get the same quality of education as their white counterparts.
Yeah,
So, so reading some of the books that at times were even illegal for him to consume, he would read. So he filled my head with ideas of the world that I believed I belonged wherever I believed I belonged. So I
that's
remember
powerful.
I think, in the 10th grade, my first time leaving. I thought I traveled so much, I didn't even know there was a country code. So I'm sitting in America dialing 031, not knowing there must be a +27. But I'm like, I phoned
Mm.
America so many times because he would just pass the phone and act like, hello, hello.
Oh wow.
And he put on accents, and I thought I traveled the world. So by the time I was traveling the world, I'd been in that place in my mind prior.
Mm.
And
That's
that
powerful.
played
Yeah,
out
yeah.
not just in the world, but in my life. It played out before I was, addressing the African Union. It played out before I was addressing the Women's Economic Forum. It played out long before. He made me live in my head that by the time it manifested into reality, it was my norm. And because he also, my mom and so are great influences of reading, that those worlds were real here, therefore they could be real here. And I find myself doing the same thing now, even looking at homes I want to live in. We literally go we literally go and even with friends, and I sit amongst the wealthiest people in the country in their homes and clubhouses that I don't have the money at the time to live in. But I must be there for me to know. I can't live what I haven't seen in my mind and experienced. And the same thing happened when I moved to Lagos. I was like a living VI, and I sit in Ikoyi and be in amongst those people. So until it became my reality. And I think it's very important that we know what we don't know, and when we don't know it, we immerse ourselves in the reality of what it could be like when we do know it.
Oh wow. That's good. That is so good. And just thinking about this, the power of what you're saying, and I'm just thinking, how do, if like you say, I'm thankful that you said you do it still now, because I'm like, okay, for people who did not have that, such a great grandfather, by the way, that you had, and shout out to him as well, because that's seeds planted that are like continuing to germinate and bring a lot of fruit. I'm just thinking about how do we unlock, because I'm gonna talk a bit to say, you know what, African continent, and you talk about this in South Africa as well, where people were denied access to many things, had a subpar kind of education, and there's a lot of still victim mentality and conversation on the broader continent as well. How do people, and this affects, not just, it affects people across different levels of socioeconomic the status, right? Like, how do people, professionals, what can they do, like you're saying, to unlock the mindset for this kind of possibility and impact and growth, because there's a lot of self-sabotage and there's like potential here, but it's not going beyond like the level. And it's what you're saying about the mind being there before ever even stepping into that. So what can people do now, especially for like professionals or people that don't have the chance to start from scratch, so to speak?
So for me, the first is, who do you need on your side? So do you need a coach? Do you need a mentor? Do you need a sponsor?
It's good.
Who potentially can practically hold your hand and guide you to where it is that you're wanting to be? Um, you know, one of one of the people I've met in my building my dream life recently said to me, Vili, brilliant estate agent here in South Africa, and we were shopping for these
Mm,
houses where I was like, I could never afford. And he said something to me that blew my mind. He said, Those who live within their means lack imagination.
Mm. That's deep.
And I was like, what? He's like, if you're living within the bounds and the
Oh wow.
constraints that you were born into,
Oh wow.
you lack imagination. And it
Oh
is
wow.
difficult for
That's a
you
good.
to imagine beyond what you give yourself exposure to. So people give you exposure, books give you exposure, what you consume gives you exposure. So I'm a big
That's
believer
good.
in consuming content of things that don't exist in my world. So I don't have a television, but I've got Netflix. I watch Selling Sunset just to see what the girls are wearing in the houses. I'm like, people have
Mm-hmm.
25 $47 million homes. I'm dreaming small,
Mm.
man. All of a sudden,
Right.
and this is if you
So
are from
good.
SADC, you'll know how this is hard. In West Africa, you don't notice. In Central Africa, I dream now in dollars.
It's good.
So now I'm not like how many rands. I'm not thinking how many
Mm.
pula, how many zim. US. How much is that in US? Okay, I can do that. Just by
Yeah.
exposing myself to people living a world in dollars elevates what's possible for me. You know, my TED talk, I talk about my first time on an airplane. We
Mm.
used to think airplanes just delivered babies and sweets. When I got on the plane, I'm like, they dress like this. Eh? They're buses that fly. Me, I'm going to be on this bus my whole life. Boom. That was a seed planted at
It's
7 years old. Here I am,
it's good.
2 decades later, and I've traveled to over 50 countries in the world. The power of
So,
exposure. Ignorance could be acceptable in the time of my grandparents
mm.
because all they had were encyclopedia. You have got Google. You choose to remain where you are now. When you self sabotage, you choose that because you literally can Google how to overcome, finish the sentence, how to create, finish the sentence. And
Yeah.
you can make that your reality. The difference is the choice to immerse yourself in that reality. Are you going to choose to have conversations with friends that limit you? Or are you going to, I recently was doing this because, I think I'm quite comfortable with my business growth in West Africa and I see the trajectory. In the US, I see the trajectory. But in East Africa, I'm like, got Rwanda, but I need to push a little bit of Kenya. I literally went
Mm.
onto LinkedIn and started those conversations. Me limiting myself in East Africa is a choice. Where you
Mm.
find yourself now is a choice. My grandfather had to
It's
be
good.
my Google, be my encyclopedia. He's not here. I now have access to www. What am I doing with that? The same is true for individuals and for entrepreneurs and for anyone who wants to make a fundamental shift in their life.
Oh, wow. Now that's so good. And this is why you're Africa's leading career coach, because this is a lot that you're saying, but very simple. And to achieve that level of simplicity, but also cut to the essential, right? Definitely is testament to that skill. And thanks for saying that. And I think the flip side of choice, when people hear this, it's not about even feeling bad. I think it's about power. It's about knowing, you know what, if I can choose not to self sabotage, then I can choose to unstock, right? To get unstuck or choose. So it's about the power of choice, right? Like being able to harness that. Um, no, this has been so good. And I just shifting gears a bit, right? Because we talked about professionals, talked about your own journey into entrepreneurship and just the mindset and how you've navigated that. Because again, you are a career coach. You're channeling people. Well, I'm curious to hear about what your thoughts are on what the workplace is going to look like in the next few years and the future of work and how people should position for that, right? Or how people should navigate that. There's a lot of turbulence on the horizon, or that has already happened with things like COVID, with forces of digital transformation and just like, geographical shifts and globalization. So what is work going to look like in the next few years? And now should African professionals be navigating that? Yeah, from you.
Okay, so I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to make this probably it's probably one of my favorite topics. So, if you are African, you are finding yourself that by the year 2040, you are going to be living in the most populous place in the world. 1 in 4 people are going to be living on your continent. If you are African, you're finding that by the year 2030, you are going to be living in a space where there are more Africans than there are Chinese, than there are Indians. Fantastic opportunity. We've seen what India has done from an IT perspective and forging the way ahead. We've seen what China has done from an investment perspective and forging the way ahead. So great, great opportunities. The biggest mistakes I find Africans making is being under the illusion that you are sitting in Mombasa in Kenya and you're competing with someone sitting in Nairobi. You're not. You are sitting in Kigali thinking, oh my goodness, I must look out for that person in Kampala. You're not. You are sitting in Accra thinking you're worried about someone in the Gold Coast. If you're sitting in Johannesburg, you're worried about someone sitting in Cairo. If you are sitting in Lagos, you're thinking, what is happening to someone in Bombela, in Eswatini? That is who you're now competing with. We always take offense as the continent, which say, oh, no, 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 we're not a country. We're a continent. But we're going to be more than a country than you know. And why this is so is that where we find ourselves, and I believe the future will hold, is the gig economy is coming to the fore, where it is no longer about you bringing a service, but you being a platform. In the same way, Uber has the largest amount of, is the biggest logistics company, but owns zero taxis. It's a platform. Airbnb, largest provider of accommodation, but owns no real estate. It's a platform. You as an individual are going to become a platform. What is on your platform? What are your skills and expertise that an organization can tap into for a finite period and close the contract? You cannot articulate that. It doesn't matter that you are in the most populous place in the world with the greatest opportunities of growth. As some people call it the last frontier. Someone sitting in Kuala Lumpur is going to have your lunch. Someone sitting in Delhi is going to come through and take it away from you because they are poised and ready. What are you doing to make sure that you are globally competitive and locally relevant? I remember saying this, I think, when I was at the African Leadership University, I think about 4 or 5 years ago. And I was like, my entire team researches what career coaches are doing. And I had zero competitor on the continent. I wasn't trying to compete with someone coming up from next door. I was thinking, what is coming from around the world? Because we're getting to a place where I need to be able to say, this is the value I can bring, and I can understand what happens on my continent. Well, most of us don't even know what's happening in Congo. You don't know. If I say to you, Congo, you don't even ask me Kinshasa or Brazza. You just like, oh, there's one. You don't even know the
Oh,
difference.
yeah.
And for
Yeah.
me, that's scary because that means the rest of the world is studying the next frontier, where the future is going to come from, where the most amount of growth is going to come from. And it's in your backyard. And you know nothing. And for me, Africans are unaware at times because we look so similar. We've got the same melanin tones. You're unaware of the diversity. And what a lot of people don't know is the diversity in Africa is from even from a molecular structure, from a DNA perspective. If you take you, Demi, you're from West Africa, I'm from Southern Africa. Do you know that a Chinese person and an American have more in common in DNA than me and you do from a DNA perspective? That is how
Interesting. I had no
diverse the
idea.
continent is. Can you imagine the nuances in culture that you've got the advantage of being first to market by virtue of the fact that you are in the same geographical space?
Yeah.
Do not take your Africanness for granted. Study it.
Mm.
Because I've had to learn the hard way, right? I've learned to succeed in business in South Africa. get my butt kicked in Nigeria, then go to Rwanda and realize, oh, what worked for me in Lagos is not going to work for me in Kigali. I've got to tone down,
Mm,
temper, move things around. So take
yeah.
advantage of being first to market by virtue of the fact that you're born here. Do not take it for granted that you know because you're born here.
Oh wow. Thanks. That's a lot. I know that you're restraining from saying a lot more, but something you said which is powerful is your is it people as a platform, right? Like it's you're going to be thinking about yourself as a platform, uh, and organizations can tap into and people can tap into, and this again is the distributor, like you're saying, way that work is going to be. It's definitely going to mean something for organizations as well, adjusting to that. But I think because we're talking to the individual, some of the things you say are very, very, very powerful in terms of how do you bring yourself up to that level, realize the game that you're in, the competition that you're facing, but also strongly position yourself uh, in that way. And with this book, Planbpreneur, some of that I've been calling it the entrepreneurial professional to say, okay, you know what? It's not just about being an entrepreneur. I mean, because people think about entrepreneurs and have different stereotypes of what an entrepreneur is and does, and but thinking about the fact that you should be entrepreneurial, whether you are identifying as a traditional entrepreneur or you're still working with organizations and you're doing a portfolio career or something that's quite in that space. But what you said just now about that platform model, hearing it for the first time, thinking about it like that is certainly powerful. And as we wrap this up, because I know that tons of other insights that you probably will bring to this. I'm trying to juggle in my head what should be like, which one should be the priority question that should be last. I know you've talked about. I'm curious to hear about how you approach uh, building. The word is multiple streams of income and impact, right? Yeah, and I guess just trying to say, okay, what ways can professionals also do that and be entrepreneurial? I think I'm trying to cheat here to just mold everything into one question. So hearing from you how you're approaching just diversifying your own options and your own life, and then how can professionals also be entrepreneurial in that some of those approaches. Yeah.
So I think I don't really believe in the concept of mutual exclusivity. I'm not either or. I'm a person who believes in and. So
Mm,
we have to be practical. I've lived and worked in various countries, and it wasn't always for impact. At times, it was for experience. At times, it was to gather the networks. At times, it was to gather the credibility,
interesting.
so I could make the impact. And I think being impatient sometimes finds us in a space where we're wanting it now. When you are sitting at the top tier, you can make commentary about the bottom tier. When you're in the bottom
Mm,
tier and you start to make comments about the top tier, you're grumbling. When you're in the
mm,
top tier, you're changing policy. Know when to
yeah.
speak. Know when it's time for impact. Know when it's time to acquire the power
Interesting.
to make impact. Um, we we say in my language, a rhino goes backwards to gather force to go forwards. What at times
Mm,
looks like you're moving backwards must not be for the sake of regression, but must be for the sake of acquiring power in order to make an impact. Know the difference.
it's good.
And in your building your career, the biggest lesson for me has been intentionality. I've been very, very intentional about the career I've built, the organizations I work for, in order for me to be able to make the highest level of impact. There is no way a little girl born in Zululand in the smallest township with one main road would have built a pan African business in Nigeria, South Africa, Rwanda, the US,
Yeah.
without
Yeah.
intentionality.
So true.
So even in that intentionality, what is it for you? I can't be all things to all people. What is that space where you are going to be intentional, where you are going to have an impact, but also create wealth? And for me, the creation of wealth, it is what is mandatory for legacy. I
Mm,
often say my ancestors gave me this surname. They did not have the privilege I have, both by law and by design, from colonization to apartheid. It is my responsibility to create opportunities for my children. I don't have an option. I have to do
it's
better
good.
because they're going to grow up in a world that is globalized, and they won't have the luxury of saying, "Yeah, but there was apartheid." No one will care. I am that missing link. That is the impact
Yeah.
that's important for me in a micro level, and hopefully that echoes on a continental level, and then from there, indeed, a global level. Hope I've answered your question.
Yeah. Yeah, no, not in the way that I thought about it, but certainly in a deeper kind of way where I think it's also like just dealing with the reality, but some of the complexities, like you mentioned. And it's good to see this perspective and to hear this perspective as well, to really say, you know what, where are you? What is important? What are you able to speak to? What is the priority at different levels? And being able to live up to that. And I think one thing you said is really like the responsibility that you have in this space and time, um, between two generations, and what you've been given and being able to use that. And I think in itself, it's the impacts. Like you talked about legacy, you talked about it twice today, and I think that I don't take lightly as well, because it's very intentional. When you mention legacy, it's intentional thinking, right? Like, and it's long term thinking, not just thinking for today or the next 5 years or the next 10 years. It's a lot more, and I can imagine that that perspective is super super powerful, and certainly will drives a lot of what you're doing and a lot of what we're seeing on the outside. Vumi, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me and answer all those questions. I'm sure that people listening to this are definitely can agree that there's a ton of value. And thank you for also contributing these insights for the Planbpreneur book. Thank you again for this conversation.
Thanks, Demi. Stay safe. Bye.
I will. Bye, and I will.